Global Advocate for Refugees and Displaced People, Ruvendrini Menikdiwela, serves as Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, in Geneva. With over 3 decades at UNHCR, she has served as representative in Pakistan and Thailand and as Director of the New York office. Throughout her remarkable career, she has dedicated herself to protecting those persecuted by war and violence.
Today, we have the privilege of speaking with an international example of leadership. She is Ruvendrini Menikdiwela. I don't know if I pronounced it.
Absolutely perfect.
She served as the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for being here with us today and welcome to Learning with Leaders.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So we are going to talk about your outstanding career and background, but first, who is Ruvendrini?
Okay, first of all, it's Ruven, because Ruvendrini is literally the name that my school teachers used. So every time someone says Ruvendrini, I keep getting this urge to stand up and say, yes, miss. So Ruven.
Okay.
But yeah, born and brought up in Sri Lanka, spent a lot more time outside Sri Lanka, unfortunately, than in Sri Lanka now. Studied in France and then was employed by UNHCR, where I have been ever since.
And when you became interested in this situation of refugee and displaced people and their right?
You know, Andrea, that's a really great question. I sit on a lot of panels where we are interviewing candidates for different positions in UNHCR, and when we ask that question, all of them, without exception, say, you know, when I was as early as 10 years old, I've always wanted to work with displaced people because I saw this happening on TV and I really wanted to help them. I am not one of those people. I have to say I came into UNHCR almost by accident. Okay. Because I studied law in Paris, and when I completed my studies, I was looking around for employment, and then I thought, you know, the United Nations sounds good, you know, interesting career paths. And then someone said, you know, there is this UN refugee agency that's based in Geneva. Why don't you apply? I mean, you have the right background. You studied international public law, international human rights law, and you seem a good fit. So I applied, and I got the job. So it's not a planned career move. It was almost accidental. But of course, the thing is, once you join UNHCR, the work is addictive. Once you start working in the humanitarian field, when you start working with refugees, you don't want to stop. So that's been my lifelong career since then.
So have you been working in the UNHCR 3 decades?
Yes, absolutely. I am a lot older than I look.
You look amazing,
Thank
by
you.
the way. So actually my question, what is you always wanted to work in the UN, but you already answered that. But what means the UN for you?
The UN for me is really diversity. It's amazing because I come from Sri Lanka where you don't see that much. You know, we have different ethnic groups, of course, but we don't really see the kind of diversity that you see in the UN. I mean, you go to work and you have a Dane, a French, an Ethiopian, a Colombian, and, you know, a Senegalese working in your team. And so this is really amazing, and everybody contributes something in terms of culture and different viewpoints. And that's important, particularly when you're working in a humanitarian agency. You do need to be aware of other cultures and to understand where the people are coming from. You know, that it's because that helps you also to deal with the human beings that you're supposed to be protecting and assisting. And it's not just the refugees, of course, it's also the different governments, the civil societies that we deal with, the religious leaders, the academics. They all come with different points of view. I mean, nobody thinks alike on, you know, many issues. So you learn to deal with that. You learn to understand, you know, to walk a mile in their shoes.
And why did you decide to start your career in human rights?
Because of the fact that because it's an evolving law, it's really something where it's never static. You know, human rights all constantly evolves, though these days, unfortunately, it seems to be going backwards and not forwards. But it's also because it's actually dealing with human beings. It's not like corporate law where you're talking about contracts and, you know, business law and things. This is really, you're dealing directly with human beings and their rights and the privileges that they should be enjoying wherever they are. So that's always been fascinating.
So you started your career in UNHCR in 1988. Mm-hmm. Can you explain for those who are unfamiliar with this organization, which is the core mission?
The core mission, it was actually very simple when it started out. And ironically, we are now marking our 75th anniversary. So we were born, if you like, UNHCR was created in 1950. And it was really just because really after World War II had ended and we had these massive populations in Europe who have been displaced by the war. Not just the Jews, but also other nationalities, of countries that had been invaded by Germany and Italy and others. So they were all displaced, many of them in entire cities, villages, communities that have been displaced. And the governments did a lot of work to repatriate them, to send, return them to where they came from. But if they couldn't go back to where they came from, then to send them to other countries or to help them to integrate where they were. But then they realized that they actually needed a dedicated UN agency to actually do that the governments alone couldn't do this job. There's just too many people, too many different governments that were involved, too many different countries that were involved, and they needed one agency that could actually oversee this whole process. So that's how UNHCR was born. We were really born to address the situation of the refugees who were created by the Second World War. So initially, our mandate was only for 5 years because everybody thought, okay, we'll create you, and after 5 years, by 1955, the refugee problem should be over, we can close you down, and we will no longer have any need for you. But look at us now, 75 years later, we are still here, unfortunately, because our job is really to work ourselves out of a job. So the day we could close down our organization and say, look, there's not a single refugee existing in the world today, so we can close UNHCR down, that would be the best day of our lives. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen anytime soon.
So the situation that we suffered in that time at the beginning of the UN, how you compare the situation with the one that we have right now?
I think because when we started off 75 years ago, we were dealing essentially with European refugee populations. So they shared a lot in common. They had a common culture, fairly similar backgrounds. They came from one continent, so they understood each other. Their cultures were very similar. But now you're dealing with, we are now present in over 130 countries. So you're dealing with different continents, different nationalities, different ethnic groups, different religions. It's a lot more complicated now than it was 75 years ago. You're really dealing with the entire world right now. And there's not a single country, I think, in the world today that has not either received refugees or produced refugees or seen refugees go through their territories. So this is really where the fundamental difference is that before it was confined to one continent, now the whole world is involved in it.
In 2015 until 2020, you were working as a representative of the UNHCR in Thailand and in Pakistan. I guess I know that both countries has a significant number of refugees. How it was to work directly in the field with them, seeing their realities?
It was interesting because it's very similar in some ways, but also extremely different in other ways. So both countries have a couple of things in common. Neither of them has signed the refugee conventions. So then they don't have any formal legal convention obligations at all. But both have received hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of refugees over decades. In Thailand, they've had Cambodian refugees, Vietnamese refugees, Myanmar refugees, and Lao refugees. At one point I remember one of the Thai foreign ministers saying, if Thailand could pack its bags and leave this location and go somewhere else, we'd be happy to do that. He said, because we are surrounded by all these extremely volatile countries. And at some point or another, they've all sought refuge in Thailand.
And we are talking about refugees, but some people misunderstand really the concept. So can you explain to us what it means to be a refugee?
The first thing to understand is that the refugee situation is forced upon people. I mean, there's no child on this planet who says, when I grow up, I want to be a refugee. That doesn't happen. This is something that is forced on you. People are compelled to flee their countries of origin because of violence, because of persecution, or because of conflict. So these are the main three reasons why people leave their countries, and they try to seek safety in other countries. So that's a critical difference between refugees and migrants, because migrants choose to leave for economic reasons. Sometimes it can be equally dire, they don't find jobs in their countries, so they feel compelled to leave their countries and go look for job opportunities elsewhere. But the critical difference is they still are able to have a government in their country of origin that's willing to protect them and to assist them, whereas refugees don't. they lose their national protection, refugees, basically. They can, because the governments are either unwilling or unable to protect them, which is why they leave. And this is really the principal difference between refugees and migrants, because these days, refugees and migrants are put in the same category. When you listen to a lot of governments of, receiving countries, they keep saying all these foreigners, all these refugees and migrants. But there is a critical difference. One category requires international protection, the other category does not. They may require other forms of assistance, job opportunities, education opportunities, but they don't require international protection. That is really for the refugees.
And when you see directly the stories of this person who are running for their life, like they have a real problem of safety, personally, do you think that these things have changed you and shaped you as a person and as a professional to see this kind of situation and these realities?
Oh, absolutely. For one thing, I come from Sri Lanka, and you may or may not know this, but Sri Lanka also went through a civil war for about 30 years. But I was away a lot of that time. So for me, I only saw it through the eyes of my family who were still in Sri Lanka and who sort of used to tell me about it. But I had never really experienced it myself. But when I joined UNHCR 37 years ago, the person I was, the Ruven that I was in 1988 is very different from the Ruven that I am now. And much of that experience, really, what has shaped me has been working in UNHCR. It's working with refugees constantly, and now with other categories as well, like the internally displaced people, stateless people, refugees who have returned home. So we're working with all of these different populations. But it's really been working with them and understanding where they're coming from. That really has been, I think, the most life-changing experience for me. It's understanding that there are people who have literally lost everything overnight sometimes. And, refugee is not a respecter of age or gender or, disabilities. Everybody's impacted the same way as if you're a refugee. The entire refugee population can be composed of women, children, elderly, the disabled. They're all impacted the same way because they're all being forced to flee. They are literally losing their homes, everything they've owned overnight, and leaving generally at the point of a gun. And you see these people, and you see them when they come to the countries of asylum, and the courage and the fortitude they show, all of them. Some of them are deeply traumatized, but the one thing that they really demonstrate every single time is this will to survive, to say, I have gone through the worst, and now I really want to go about reestablishing my life. And that is really one of the most amazing things. And I think one of the things that keeps UNHCR staff working every day, we show up for work really because of that. It's not because the refugees depend on us, because many of them have shown that if they're given the right tools and the right opportunities, they become self-reliant immediately. But it's really the fact that if they can go through unimaginable, horrendous experiences, be raped, be abused physically, arrive in a country of asylum and say, fine, I've been through the worst, I need support, but I want to stand on my own 2 feet as soon as I possibly can. And all refugees, without exception, the ones that I have spoken to, have all said that. Regardless of what age they are, what backgrounds they come from, the first thing they want is to become self-reliant, not to depend on anybody, to feel that they're in control of their own lives and their own futures. And I think that's really the thing that drives us in UNHCR.
So you have a long experience talking about refugee and displacement. In 2020, you became the director of the agency in the organization in New York. How was the transition between Pakistan, Thailand, and after New York?
I have to say, you couldn't think of a worse transition, because I went to New York about 3 days before lockdown because of COVID.
Okay.
And already going from Pakistan to New York was a bit of a sort of a fairly traumatic mind shift, because in Pakistan, you're in a very operational environment, and we are dealing with Afghan refugees every single day. You're going to the settlements, you're negotiating with the Pakistani authorities, you're getting people out of jail, you're preventing people from being put on trucks and sent back to Afghanistan. So you're doing all of this, and then you go to New York, and New York is all about meetings. It's about networking with the member states and with other parts of the UN and with some of the big organizations and non-profit organizations working in New York. So it's all about getting to know people, dressing up nicely so that they take you seriously, learning to speak with them, speak the language that they want you to speak. And that all has to happen so there's a personal contact that's absolutely necessary in New York. But so when I went there and suddenly I was forced to do everything virtually through Zoom and Teams, it was very, very difficult. So I was meeting some of the heads of the UN agencies, some of the ambassadors for the first time on Zoom. So I used to see them sitting there, and of course, you can only see the head and shoulders, and I'm thinking, is he actually listening to me, or is he quietly doing his emails under the table? So it's very difficult to make that personal connection when you're actually meeting them virtually for the first time. But nevertheless, you have to do it because you have to be very present in some of the very critical meetings in New York, just to make sure that people understand that there is a world outside the New York bubble, that there are, human displacement happening, human suffering happening, and if we don't talk about it, nobody else is going to do it.
You launched the strategic framework from 2025 to 2030. So could you share which is the main goal or the priorities of UNHCR for the protection of refugees and displaced people with these years ahead?
If you'd asked me this question even 1 year ago, my answer might have been very different. But we are living in a world right now where, as you know, the humanitarian sector is in crisis because of the fact that one of the biggest donors has basically reduced the funding, and a lot of our other donors as well are reducing their funding because they're looking at reinforcing their national defense budgets. So their international aid and cooperation budgets have gone down. And the United States has been our single largest donor for the last few decades. So when they told us from one day to the next that they're going to be reducing their contributions and that we need to look at other governments and other entities to fill that gap, that became extremely difficult. And this is what we're grappling with now. But in the midst of all of that, we have been very clear. We have 3 priorities: protection, solutions, and emergency response. That's the life-saving activities that we do. So going forward, those are the 3 critical areas that we're going to be really focusing on in the months and years ahead. It's really protecting refugees, making sure they have access to basic standards of treatment, and trying to find solutions for them, whether it's staying in the country where they are, but helping them to become self-reliant so that they don't depend on humanitarian aid, or resettling them in a third country, or helping them to go back to their countries of origin when the conditions are, lend themselves to that. Like in Syria, for example, right now. We are very happy because even, 8 months ago, we would not have imagined that there would be a change of regime in Syria, as it happened last December. After 14 years of exile, we've had 2 million Syrian refugees and IDPs going back to their places of origin since December last year. That's amazing. That was not something we had planned for. But we also know that Syria, has been through 14 years of war. So a lot of the infrastructure has been completely destroyed. So these Syrians are going back literally to nothing. No schools, no hospitals, no income generating, no job markets available. So if they don't receive that quickly, they're going to turn around and go right out again and go back to the countries of asylum from where they came. And we want to prevent that. So our big message to donors is, you have to work with us to provide solutions for refugees, because you've already told us you don't want to continue to give us funding to help refugees where they are. So if you want us to stop that funding, you want us to identify solutions for refugees, then you actually need to invest in the countries of origin when conditions are conducive for refugees to be able to go back, so that refugees then can go back and stay there.
Because with an overview of the people who has been forced to change their life, to go away, what do you think is the situation right now globally?
I think, in all my 37 years, I have never seen such a perfect storm, of working in the UN, such a perfect storm where you have extremely significant, deep political divides. I was working in, as I said, in New York, and we saw the Security Council and the General Assembly, and they're constantly fighting. We see very little consensus politically on the political stage. And what has happened is, because there's a lack of political will to resolve some of these crises, the humanitarian agencies become the proxies for that. It's like, well, okay, so we can't resolve this political crisis, the war in Ukraine, because we can't get the warring factions to come together to arrive at a peace agreement. So we'll just keep funding the UN agencies that are actually helping the refugees and the internally displaced in Ukraine. So it's almost like we are being used as an excuse not to resolve conflicts. And we really have a problem with that, because it's the same governments who are refusing to resolve conflicts that are also now telling us we are not going to fund you as much as we have done in the past. So we are saying something's got to give. You've either got to take your responsibilities as politicians seriously and start resolving some of these conflicts, or you've got to continue to fund us in even bigger greater amounts, because the displacement issue is not going away anytime soon. The numbers are increasing. We have 122 million forcibly displaced people in the world today, out of whom over 42 million are refugees. So they've actually crossed left their countries of origin and gone into another country. And over 73 million are IDPs, so people who have been displaced within their own countries because of fighting, because of persecution, because of violence. And someone's got to help these people. So you, the big donors, the big political powers, you need to take up your responsibilities and really resolve these political crises, or continue to fund us the way we need it to be funded to be able to help all of these people. And that's not happening right now. So you find numbers of conflicts increasing. I think there are over 120 conflicts in the world today, involving over 93 member states, over 93 countries. And I remember at one point the late Pope Francis saying, I don't know why everybody keeps saying the Third World War might happen. He said it's already happening. You just haven't connected the dots between all of these different conflicts. And he was right. The Holy Father was right, because it's absolutely what's happening right now. I mean, again, there's not a single continent or a single region that is immune to conflict right now.
And how the United Nations can push, or we can say as well, a citizen can push to this government, to these member states, to at least, as you say, take responsibility of what they are doing. And I guess the better end will be to stop, of course, all conflicts, but being realistic with what we have, which is the pressure that we can say, that the UN can do for this.
I think the UN has tried. Unfortunately, the political organs of the UN, and UNHCR is certainly not part of that. We are the humanitarian, wing. But the political organs of the UN are essentially the Security Council and the General Assembly. And I saw it at first hand. They were unable to agree on all of the critical political issues of today. You have one faction that says, Russia was right to invade Ukraine, the other, or at least not right, but at least that they were justified in invading Ukraine. Then you have another faction says, no, that's absolutely illegal what they have done. But you cannot get any of these different parties, and that's happening with the Gaza right now. You have certain member states that are justifying all of the different actions in Gaza, military actions in Gaza, and another faction which is saying this is absolutely horrendous what's happening right now, and it's against all forms of international law, whether it's humanitarian law or human rights law, and you have to stop immediately. And what happened before was that you could at least get these factions to arrive at a compromise. They might not necessarily agree on everything, but at least they'd agree on the way forward. That's not happening right now. These people these member states cannot agree on anything even as fundamental as giving humanitarian access to agencies like UNHCR or UNRWA in the Middle East to have access to these populations who need us the most in terms of protection and assistance.
So, and in the meantime, the politics are talking and trying to agree in something. We have people suffering and people who are seeing how their lives and their houses and their families and everything is leaving behind. So for you, as you work in protection, what do you think is the main challenges that people and, refugee and displaced people are facing in today's world?
I think the main challenges, there are several. One is, of course, when they're forced to leave. As I said, more often than not, they leave with nothing except the clothes on their backs. But they're also extremely vulnerable when they're leaving. In Sudan, some of the Sudanese women coming into Chad had been raped several times on the journey. I mean, it's horrendous. So, and in many countries, like in the DRC, rape and sexual violence are used as a weapon of war by the different warring parties to intimidate and to scare the civilian populations. So rape has become a weapon, just like any other military weapon. And we are seeing more and more of this, as I said, principally certainly in the Sudan and in the Congolese situations, but we're also seeing it elsewhere, in Myanmar, for example. And the thing is, so this is one risk that a lot of refugee women and girls go through and children go through. Then you also have a lot of, certainly in situations of refugees fleeing conflict, you have a lot of kids being separated from their families or who have no family because their parents have been killed, and they live with the rest of the village or with the rest of the community, but with absolutely no protection at all because they've lost their entire family support. But even once they're in the countries of asylum, so aside from identifying them and trying to get them this specialized assistance, they face a lot of hostility in many countries. We all know that. I mean, you scroll through the social media networks, you open the newspapers, you switch on the TVs, and you see, refugees and migrants are evil, they're criminals, they're raping our women, they're taking our jobs, we need to block our borders to prevent these people from coming. So we hear that constantly. And for the refugees, they see it, they experience this at first hand. They're threatened, they're told to, leave, go home. And they're already deeply traumatized. And they're faced with the second trauma of not being received well in the countries where they actually seek asylum. So those are some of the terrible things, the xenophobia, the racism that they face in the countries of asylum, sometimes very similar to the kinds of persecution they had actually faced in the countries of origin, ironically. So those are the challenges that we are really looking at right now.
I want to point out that I'm from Spain. So in Spain, we are really aware of what is happening with the migrants and refugees and people displaced, because we are receiving a lot of people from many countries. And we saw in the news also the tragedy behind. We found bodies in our beaches. We see what a lot of lives are missing in the Mediterranean. So what do you think is the most dangerous route for migrants and for refugees? There is any solution for this situation?
No, that's a very good question. I have to say Spain has been incredibly generous in hosting refugees, but also in contributing funding to the refugee operations. And the country that has the largest contributions from individual donors, that is people on the street in Spain, are the Spaniards actually. So individual giving, which is one of our income generating resources, has been Spain. That basically we have all these UNHCR teams going out and talking to people coming out of metro stations and bus stops and saying, can you help us by funding UNHCR, funding programs? So Spain has always stepped up. So the single largest individual donor contributions come from Spain. So thank you for that. So you really, that's something to be proud of. And Spain is also doing other good things. They're really thinking outside the box. They have realized that refugee resettlement is one solution, where resettlement countries say, okay, Pakistan has hosted refugees for a huge amount of time now, 40 plus years. So we are going to take a certain number of Afghan refugees to Spain, to the United States. Well, no longer to the United States, but Canada, Australia, etc. They all agree that they'll take a certain number of refugees every year from different countries of first asylum. That is a great solution, but the numbers are dropping because more and more of these countries are saying, no, sorry, we can't afford to take too many refugees because we have our own problems back home. So, but what countries like Spain are doing is saying, this is true, we can't absorb refugees, we cannot integrate them, but what we can do is provide them with other forms of pathways to come into Spain. So labor mobility, for example. So basically what Spain is saying is they've told some of the private Spanish companies, look, if you can if you will employ refugees, and if you will train for them to get the skills that are required, we, the Spanish government, will give them work visas so that they can actually come to Spain and work. There are refugee populations living in other countries, but they can come to Spain as labor migrants on work visas and then actually contribute to the Spanish economy, but also become self-reliant. So these are some of the initiatives that some countries like Spain are initiating right now and which we are very, very happy about. But that's still a Band-Aid. I mean, as you said, there are huge numbers of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants paying smugglers and traffickers to take them on these incredibly dangerous journeys. So what we have always been saying is, look, we have been adopting what we call a panoramic approach or a route-based approach, basically saying, you, the global north, if you want to stop people from undertaking these incredibly dangerous journeys and losing their lives in the process and being abused and exploited by traffickers and smugglers, you need to help us in several ways. One is to help us look at conditions in the countries of origin to prevent people from being forced to leave. So to help us stabilize these populations Syria is a classic example, so that people are not compelled to leave. And if they have been compelled to leave, that they actually can now return. And the second cluster is countries of first asylum, Pakistan, Thailand, and other countries. To invest in these countries, to give these refugees opportunities there, not to leave them in refugee settlements or refugee camps for 10, 15, 40 years, but to give them opportunities to invest in these countries to help the refugees and the host communities, because in many of these countries, the host communities are in the same socioeconomic situation as the refugees themselves. So it's not like the host communities are living in luxury houses while the refugees are living in settlements. Sometimes you can't even tell the difference between a refugee settlement and a local settlement, because they all pretty much on the same levels of poverty in many of these countries. So it's really investing in countries of origin, in countries of first asylum, and also processing in countries of transit, because some of these refugees and asylum seekers go through countries like Tunisia. They don't want to stay in Tunisia. They want to go to Spain, to France, or Germany, or Scandinavia, to basically say, look, help us to set up processing centers in these transit countries so that refugees don't feel compelled to cross the Mediterranean using these leaky boats where, many of them capsize, many people drown. Instead, allow them to be processed in countries like Tunisia. So the refugees who are, they go through a screening, and if they're found to be refugees, then you, the destination countries, must decide on the basis of solidarity and responsibility sharing that you will accept a certain number of these refugees into your territories.
Now, talking about your leadership position, you have been leader in Pakistan, in Thailand, in New York, now here in Geneva. What value do you think that you have for quality, we can say quality you have that help you to have this roles?
Look, I wouldn't really describe myself as a leader. Maybe part of the senior management, yes. Leader, probably not. But one of the things, and again, as I said, I'm a very different person to the person who joined UNHCR 30 plus years ago. And UNHCR has shaped me. It really has. It's the experiences that I have had in this organization that have really made me become the person I am. But some of the qualities that you really require if you're working, particularly in a humanitarian agency, which is my experience, and I can't speak for other agencies, in development agencies, for example. But what you need if you're working in the humanitarian sector, one is to understand that you're not going to change the world. When you're in your 20s, you think you're going to be able to reform the world and make it the way it should be. I mean, when I was a student in Paris, I spent a lot of nights with bottles of wine talking to my friends and saying, if I was a leader, this is what I would do to make the world a better place. The reality is, of course, that you're not going to change the world, but you can change a little bit of it. The part that you control, the people that you're protecting, the people that you're assisting. So you need to be a bit modest in your aspirations as to what you can and cannot do. The other thing is to learn from others, to listen to others and to learn from them. Whether it's from the refugees themselves, understanding where they're coming from, the incredible courage that it takes to do what they're doing every single day in the country of asylum. To understand, I don't know, walk a mile in their shoes. Understand, if I, from one day to the next, was forced to leave my country with nothing and to start all over again, having suffered horrendous experiences along the journey, raped, abused, exploited, all my money stolen, everything that I've ever had, how would I deal with that situation? I probably would be a basket case, but then you see these refugees completely, I met this Congolese woman and she was an internally displaced woman in the Democratic Republic of Congo about 3 months ago when I was there. And she had walked for almost 2 weeks to get to this site where she was being assisted. She had walked with 4 children, tiny kids, and she looked barely older, she looked like a teenager herself, and she already had these 3 kids. One had died on the way. She had arrived with these 3 kids. She had been raped multiple times on the way. So I spoke to her as a group of women that we were talking to who were survivors of gender-based violence, but also who were community leaders. And her principal thing, she didn't even want to, she said, yes, I got raped, I was abused, I saw one of my children die, but what I want now is to get over all that. I want a future for my 3 kids, the ones who are with me now, and I want to help other people, other women in my community who have suffered similar experiences. I want them to understand what I went through, but to learn from it and to work together to overcome it. And I'm going I could never, ever have that kind of courage. So these are the things you learn from listening to people, understanding where they're coming from, and not necessarily your colleagues and governments or, civil society, but really listening to the refugees themselves. So it's being flexible, it's listening to others, learning from other people's experiences, and never being afraid to take a risk. Don't be afraid to go out there and do something that you think is right, even if everybody else says, that's crazy, that's not going to do your career any good, you're really not going to benefit from this. If you believe that's the right thing to do, then go ahead and do it. Because at the end of the day, in the humanitarian sector, that's what counts. It's not doing the easy thing, it's doing the difficult thing, and it's doing the right thing.
And what would you say that is your biggest success in your career or personally?
Look, I wouldn't talk about successes, because what I would have loved to see is to be able to say, I walked out of Pakistan having resolved the situation of the 3 million Afghans in Pakistan. That would be a success. Unfortunately, we don't have many successes like that. So I can't really talk about successes in that sense. I think more it's the individual successes. Mm-hmm. It's having, a refugee who has been resettled writing to me and saying, you won't remember me, but I saw your email in some group chat, and I just want to let you know you helped me. You probably don't even remember it, but you helped me a long time ago when I was a refugee in Thailand, in Turkmenistan, whatever. I have now been resettled and I got my degree and I'm now working in an IT firm, and I just want you to know that I did okay. For me, that's amazing. And that's when you think, okay, you know what? I actually did make a difference in someone's life. And that's really the reason for all of us to get up and go to work every morning. For most people in UNHCR, that's what moves us.
It's how you say you cannot change the world, but you can change people's lives.
Absolutely, exactly.
So just to finish, first of all, thank you very much for
You're welcome.
All this expertise and all this insight and all your dedication that you are doing, and just to share it with us is so amazing. So thank you very much. And just to finish, I want to ask you the final question that I do to all the guests. So what advice would you give to those who want to become a leader? What has been your formula for success?
Follow your convictions. Don't be afraid to take those risks. Go out there, do what you believe it to be right, do what you believe in. That's certainly one lesson. The other thing is understand, particularly in the humanitarian field, you don't have a proper work-life balance. Something has to give. And more often than not, it's a life, your personal life that you sacrifice a lot. Because humanitarian work is never 9 to 5. You don't go in, as I said, you don't go in at 9 o'clock and think, okay, by 6 o'clock I'm done, I'm going to go home, and then I'm going to focus on my spouse and my kids or whatever. That doesn't happen. More often than not, especially in the field, at 10 o'clock in the evening, you're still dealing with an emergency. Maybe, an attack on a camp, people, as I said, refugees being put on trucks and deported. Understand that this is not a job, it's a commitment, it's a vocation. It's not something that you can switch on and off as you could in other professional fields. So that's, I think, the advice that I would give.
Once again, thank you very much, Ruben, for being here. Before you to leave, please, it will be an honor if you sign our banner and join our family of learning with leaders. But again, thank you very much for being here.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting me once again.